This is Political Communication, and this lesson deals with visual narratives, how the narrative policy framework is used to tell political stories. And I'm your professor, Dr. Patrick Stewart. With this lesson, let's go back over the basics again, because they matter. They especially matter when we consider how visuals apply to storytelling. The first fundamental rule of political narratives is, if you're losing, expand the scope of conflict by simplifying and making the issue emotionally relevant. On the other hand, if you're winning, do the opposite. Constrain the scope of conflict by making things complex and difficult to understand. If at all possible, make it sound like what is going on has been going on for a very long time. In other words, it's natural. It's the status quo. It's what has always been done. The second fundamental rule of political narratives is blame the other side and make it look like it was intentional on their part. If there is ever any blame that is to fall on your side, make it seem like it was accidental or just part of the system in place, and that you and your side had no control over it. The third fundamental rule of political narratives is that the opposition is the devil, and they only operate with malicious motives. On the other hand, your side is either on the side of angels or are angels themselves. Hardworking individuals who only want to solve problems out of the good of your hearts. Now, obviously, life is much more complex, but storytelling makes things easy for all of us. Next, know the structure of your narrative. Focus on the 4 core elements. First, know where your narrative is taking place and make sure that you take advantage of that setting, whether it's legal, constitutional, geographic, economic, norms, evidence, or whatever. Second, know who your characters are and make sure that they are compelling. If possible, have the victims or the heroes present themselves to arouse emotions. If people can see them, they can see that they're there in glory in their heroism or feel pity for the victimhood. And if there is a villain, make sure that they're not there so that the villain can't respond. Third, have a plot so that your audience knows what the relationship is between the characters, as well as the relationship between the situation that the characters find themselves in. And lastly, make sure that you have a moral to the story. Try to keep it as simple as possible and in line with the policy solution you are promoting. So let's take a look at the grander scale, which is whether it's a macro level with grand societal narratives, the meso level with competing group stories, or the micro level with the individual tales. Now, the macro level deals with grand narratives. Now, political scientists, we love looking at macro level narratives to consider power relationships. Ask questions such as, where does the power come from? Who has the power? How can it be used? And are there any constraints in its use? Most of these narratives, well, they're stable. And that's the main thing. They provide structure for our lives, and they're very rarely questions. And then when they do change, they are major events that's marked by institutional and cultural shifts. So, from the monotheistic Western societal perspective, the critical tension concerns where does ultimate knowledge come from and how fallible are our leaders. The Protestant Reformation saw a shift from divine knowledge deriving from institutions such as the Catholic Church to the idea of individual revelation. With the Renaissance and the Enlightenment in the 18th century, the shift came from revealed knowledge from the divine to observational knowledge. In other words, it wasn't knowledge that you got inside you, it came from watching the world around you. And then finally, we have the American and French Revolutions, which a shift went from rule by divine right to rule based upon power from the people. Now, this latter point is important because it ties into evolutionary biology considerations that we see cross-culturally concerning group power, not just with humans, but also with all mammalian groups. The questions concern the tension between leaders and followers as to who should have more power and how should they use it. Should it be more authoritarian with centralized power structures that emphasize power of the leader? Or should it be more egalitarian with a focus on decentralized power and individual decision making? These are the classic political science questions. The meso level considers the agora neurons. In ancient Greece, the agora was the physical and public space where citizens took action to achieve their desired policy goal, principally through reasoned and impassioned narratives. In other words, they talked with each other. In modern times, we see that the agora neurons is a virtual space, whether it's seen on cable television or on social media. The problem now is that it is so easily accessible that anyone can talk, and whoever is able to access it first oftentimes has the loudest bullhorn and drowns out all other speech, even speech that makes worthwhile points. Which means that we as storytellers must understand not just the narrative and how it's put together, but also how the agora neurons is being utilized and what its effects are on what is heard and what is not heard. The micro level is the homo neurons. Now, this model is best understood as an evolving psychological model of the individual. This model acknowledges the primacy of effect and narration in human decision making and cognition. The basic idea is that of bounded rationality, which assumes that humans are rational, but under time constraints and with limited information, individuals settle for the acceptable alternative. Now, this assumption that humans are rational might be a false starting point because we did not evolve to be rational. We evolved with heuristics in mind, these shorthands that are rooted in what we had to address. Past experience, expertise, training, and biological bases all lead to shortcuts. And these are tools that looks for information that supports one's point of view. And this is because changing one's mind is hard. Now, with the primacy of affect, we see that emotion precedes reason in processing information because we have evolved to respond quickly to threats and opportunities in the environment. Taking the time out to more fully consider decisions is a difficult thing to do, but ultimately it is the most human thing to do. Now, building off this, we see two kinds of information processing. System 1, or hot cognition, which refers to unconscious, involuntary, and automatic thought processes that we either are born with or learn through prolonged practice. Then there's System 2, which is cold cognition. It's active, but it's evolutionarily primed to run in a low effort mode so that it's only called upon when we have to deal with complex issues. Now, where the narrative cognition comes in, primary means by which humans make sense of the world and situate themselves in the world, and tell stories to each other to learn things. This is the way that humans make their existence meaningful, because it provides the essential linkages between systems 1 and 2, that's automatic response and more thoughtful response. Lastly, we deal with a micro level. First of all, you have narrative breach. As the narrative's level of breach increases, an individual exposed to that narrative is more likely to be persuaded. Secondly, we have narrative transportation. As individuals are transported into the narrative, they live it more fully. They are more likely to be persuaded by that narrative. In other words, if you feel that you are a part of a created world, you are affected by it emotionally and as a result, cognitively. Third, as perception of congruence increases and the narrative coheres with your prior cultural expectations, an individual is more likely to be persuaded by that narrative. If you agree with something, you're more likely to agree with what follows from that statement. This means that knowing the language of a person and the stories that they tell is important to changing their minds. Fourth, as narrator trust increases, an individual is more likely to be persuaded by the narrative. This is the whole celebrity endorsement effect where someone says, I'm not a doctor, but I play one on TV. And then they sell you something. You're more likely to be persuaded by someone that is a celebrity that you see weekly than you are by an expert. As a result, this might lead to bad decision making. And this ultimately leads to our last application, power of characters. The portrayal of policy narrative characters, whether they're heroes, victims, villains, or any of those auxiliary types, has a higher levels of influence on opinions and preferences of citizens, elected officials, and elites than any scientific or technical information. In other words, stories, narratives, matter more than does data and experience.